The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Sarah Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her designer blazer feeling strangely out of place in the traffic court. After spending 3 months dodging bullets and documenting war crimes in Syria, sitting here for a speeding ticket felt almost laughable. The courtroom smelled of old wood and anxiety. Around her, other defendants fidgeted and whispered, clutching their tickets and rehearsing their excuses. Sarah didn't need excuses, she had facts. Her flight from Damascus had been delayed by 8 hours due to unexpected military actions, making her miss the initial payment deadline for her ticket. Simple as that. She watched as a young mother ahead of her pleaded with Judge Henderson about a parking violation. The judge, a man in his 60s with steel gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, barely looked up from his papers as he reduced her fine. His voice carried the bored tone of someone who had heard every possible story 1,000 times before. Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling through the photos she had taken just days ago: destroyed buildings, refugee camps, children playing in the rubble of what used to be their schools. Her editor at the International Press Corps had warned her about coming straight to court from the airport, but the deadline was the deadline. She hadn't even had time to change out of her travel clothes. Case number 47, the court clerk called out. Sarah Mitchell, speeding violation on Highway 40. Sarah stood up, smoothing down her wrinkled blazer. Her press badge was still hanging from her neck. She hadn't thought to remove it after clearing customs. As she walked to the defendant's podium, she could feel Judge Henderson's eyes following her. His expression changed almost imperceptibly as he took in her appearance, a young black woman in expensive but rumpled clothes. Miss Mitchell, he began, his tone carrying that same hint of condescension she had heard so many times before. You were caught doing 72 in a 55 zone, and you failed to pay the fine within the designated 30-day period. Do you have an explanation for the court? Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the judge continued before she could get a word out. I see here that this isn't your first speeding violation. There's one from last year as well. Your Honor, if I could explain. Sarah started, her voice steady from years of reporting under pressure. The time for explanations was within the designated payment period. Ms. Mitchell. Judge Henderson cut her off, peering down at her over his glasses. Your failure to appear or pay shows a disregard for our traffic laws and this court's time. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. Just 3 days ago, she had been interviewing a general about international law violations, and now she was being lectured about traffic laws. She could feel her press credentials pressing against her chest, tucked beneath her blazer. One simple revelation would change everything, but something made her wait. The original fine was $280. Judge Henderson continued, his pen hovering over the paperwork. Given your history and failure to appear, I'm doubling it to $560. Do you understand? The courtroom had grown quiet. Sarah could feel the eyes of the other defendants on her back. This was a familiar feeling, being underestimated, being judged before speaking a single word. She had felt it in newsrooms, in war zones, and now here in this small county courthouse. She reached slowly into her bag, past her satellite phone and the notebook filled with interviews from Syrian refugees. Her fingers found her international press court credentials, along with the official documentation of her recent assignments. 3 months of war correspondence, of dodging sniper fire and documenting human rights violations, all while this speeding ticket sat unopened in her mailbox. Your Honor, she said calmly, her voice carrying the same professional tone she used in her broadcasts. I believe I have some relevant information that might explain my delayed response to this ticket. Judge Henderson's eyes narrowed as Sarah pulled out her credentials. The late morning light caught the golden press badge, making it shine like a beacon in the quiet courtroom. The judge's hand, still holding his pen over the fine paperwork, froze mid-motion. Your Honor, I've been working as a war correspondent in Syria for the past 3 months, Sarah said, her voice clear and professional. She placed her press credentials on the podium in front of her. I was documenting civilian casualties and interviewing refugees when this ticket's payment deadline passed. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Henderson's expression flickered between disbelief and confusion. He had seen thousands of defendants come through his courtroom, each with their own story, their own excuse. But this was different. Ms. Mitchell, he said, his tone still stern but with a hint of uncertainty. While your occupation is interesting, it doesn't excuse breaking traffic laws or missing payment deadlines. Sarah nodded patiently. She had faced tougher audiences, military commanders, hostile government officials, even armed militants. She reached into her bag again and pulled out her recent passport, thick with entry and exit stamps from conflict zones. Next to it, she placed her official assignment papers from the International Press Corps. 3 days ago, I was in Damascus, she continued, her tired eyes meeting the judge's. I was scheduled to return last week, but our crew had to delay departure due to heavy shelling in the area. I came straight here from the airport because I respect this court's time and authority. The judge picked up her press credentials, studying them carefully. His fingers traced over the embossed logo of one of the world's most respected news organizations. The courtroom remained silent, every person leaning forward slightly, trying to catch every word. I have footage on my phone, Sarah added quietly, of the conditions that delayed our departure. Would you like to see why I couldn't make it back in time for the original deadline? Before the judge could respond, a young law clerk in the back of the courtroom spoke up. Your Honor, I recognize Ms. Mitchell. She did that big story last month about the children's hospital in Aleppo. It was nominated for an international award. Judge Henderson's face changed as recognition slowly dawned. He had watched that very report with his wife during dinner. The powerful images of doctors working without electricity, of mothers cradling injured children, had moved him to tears. He remembered commenting on the bravery of the journalist who had ventured into such dangerous territory to tell these stories. Looking at Sarah now, he saw her in a completely different light. The wrinkled blazer wasn't a sign of disrespect. It was the uniform of someone who had just crossed continents to face her responsibilities. The tired eyes weren't from indifference, but from witnessing humanity at its worst and best. Miss Mitchell, he said, his voice noticeably softer, perhaps you could help the court understand the exact circumstances of your delayed return. Sarah pulled out her phone and pulled up a video. The sounds of distant explosions filled the courtroom as she showed footage from her last day in Syria. The timestamp clearly showed the date, just 3 days ago. We were supposed to leave on the 15th, which would have given me time to handle this ticket properly, she explained, her voice steady despite the weight of the memories. But the roads to the airport were closed due to military activity. Our team stayed to document the impact on civilian areas. When we finally got clearance to leave, I came straight here. The other defendants in the courtroom watched in stunned silence. The same judge who had been ready to double her fine minutes ago now sat back in his chair, his earlier certainty visibly shaken. I apologize for missing the deadline, Sarah concluded, and I accept whatever penalty the court deems appropriate. I just wanted to explain why I couldn't be here sooner. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy as Judge Henderson studied the video on Sarah's phone. His reading glasses sat low on his nose as he watched footage of buildings crumbling under distant artillery fire. The timestamp showed 3:47 a.m., just 3 days ago. In the background, he could hear Sarah's steady voice reporting on the situation, professional even as explosions lit up the night sky. Your coverage, he said slowly, removing his glasses. I remember it now. You were the one who interviewed those orphan children last month. His voice had lost all its earlier harshness. Instead, there was something like wonder in it, mixed with embarrassment. Sarah nodded quietly. Yes, Your Honor. That story was part of our series on how the conflict affects innocent civilians. Those children had lost everything except hope. She paused, remembering the faces of those kids who had smiled despite their circumstances. One of them gave me this bracelet. She held up her wrist, showing a simple braided string bracelet in faded colors. The young law clerk who had recognized her earlier was now showing other court staff something on his phone. Their whispers grew louder as they pulled up more of Sarah's recent reports. The evidence of her work, her dedication, and her courage was right there for everyone to see. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, clearly struggling with how to proceed. The simple traffic court session had transformed into something entirely unexpected. He looked down at the fine paperwork in front of him, the double penalty he had been so quick to impose now seeming incredibly petty. Miss Mitchell, he began, his tone completely different from earlier, the court appreciates you coming here directly from your assignment. Most people, he paused, choosing his words carefully, most people would have taken time to rest first. Sarah adjusted her press badge, which now lay visible on her blazer. Your Honor, I've learned that responsibilities don't go away just because we're tired. Whether it's reporting from a war zone or dealing with a speeding ticket, I believe in facing things directly. The judge nodded, a small smile touching his lips. Your commitment to responsibility is admirable. He looked around the courtroom, aware that every person was watching this exchange intently. However, I believe I may have been hasty in my earlier judgment. He picked up his pen again, but this time not to impose a fine. Given the extraordinary circumstances and your clear commitment to both professional and personal responsibility, I'm going to reduce the fine to the original amount. He paused, then added, and I'm going to give you an additional 30 days to pay it, considering your recent return to the country. A soft murmur of approval went through the courtroom. Sarah stood straight, maintaining her professional composure, though her eyes showed relief. Thank you, Your Honor. But Judge Henderson wasn't finished. Miss Mitchell, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you something. He leaned forward slightly. My wife and I watched your report about the hospital in Aleppo. How did you find the courage to stay and film when the bombing started? For the first time that morning, Sarah's professional mask softened slightly. Sometimes, Your Honor, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Those doctors and nurses needed their story told. They were the real heroes. The judge looked down at his bench, then back at Sarah. I believe I owe you an apology, Ms. Mitchell. I made assumptions when you walked into my courtroom, and those assumptions were wrong. Very wrong. Sarah smiled gently. Your Honor, in my line of work, I've learned that assumptions are something we all make. It's what we do after we realize our assumptions were wrong that matters. The whole courtroom seemed to absorb these words. Even the bailiff was nodding slowly. Judge Henderson sat back in his chair, a look of deep thought on his face. In just 30 minutes, his entire day, and perhaps his entire approach to his work, had been transformed. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed completely. What started as a routine traffic court session had transformed into something much more meaningful. Judge Henderson straightened the papers on his bench, then did something unusual. He stepped down from his raised platform to speak with Sarah at eye level. Miss Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying genuine interest. Would you be willing to share more about your experiences with our court staff? I believe we could all learn something valuable from your perspective. Sarah glanced at her watch. Her body was still on Damascus time, and she hadn't slept in nearly 24 hours. But she saw something important happening here, a moment of real change, and her reporter's instinct told her this mattered. I'd be happy to, Your Honor, she replied, stifling a yawn. Though I apologize if I'm not at my most eloquent. It's been a long journey. The judge turned to his clerk. James, could you ask Carol to bring in some coffee from my office? He looked back at Sarah. The good stuff, not the courthouse usual. I think we could all use it. As the clerk hurried out, other court staff began gathering closer. The remaining defendants in the room stayed in their seats, but they too leaned forward, eager to hear more. Sarah pulled out her laptop, which still had sand from the Syrian desert in its crevices. This was from my last assignment, she said, opening a folder of photographs. It's a story that never made it to air because of the evacuation. The images showed a group of young girls in a makeshift classroom, learning despite the sound of warfare in the distance. Judge Henderson looked at the photos with growing amazement. These children, they're studying despite everything going on around them. Sarah nodded. Their teacher told me something I'll never forget. She said, education is the only thing they can't take from you with bombs. These girls walked 2 hours each way to attend class in a basement. The court reporter, a middle-aged woman named Betty, wiped a tear from her eye. And here we complain about the courthouse elevator being slow, she said softly. The coffee arrived, and as Sarah sipped the hot drink gratefully, she continued sharing her experiences. She told them about the elderly man who insisted on serving her tea while his neighborhood was being shelled, about the young doctor who worked 72 hours straight during a crisis, and about the children who still played soccer in streets lined with rubble. The human spirit, she explained, is incredibly resilient. I've seen people maintain their dignity and kindness in situations we can barely imagine. It's changed how I see everything, including being here today. Judge Henderson listened intently, occasionally asking thoughtful questions. The more Sarah spoke, the more he seemed to be reconsidering something deep within himself. "Miss Mitchell," he said finally, "I've been a judge for 23 years. I prided myself on being fair and impartial. But today, you've made me realize that perhaps I've become too mechanical in my judgments, too quick to make assumptions." Sarah set down her coffee cup. "Your Honor, may I share something I've learned from my work?" When he nodded, she continued, "In journalism, we're taught to always ask questions before making conclusions. Every story has layers, every person has depth. Sometimes the most important story is the one we almost missed because we thought we already knew what we were seeing." The bailiff, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Like when you first walked in, ma'am, we all thought, well, we thought we knew exactly what this case was going to be." "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "And that's the bigger story here, isn't it? Not just about a missed deadline or a traffic ticket, but about how quickly we can misjudge situations and people." Judge Henderson stood up straighter, a decision forming in his mind. "I believe, Miss Mitchell, that your experience today could help create some important changes in how we conduct our court." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Would you be willing to help us with that?" Sarah sat in Judge Henderson's private chambers, surrounded by law books and framed certificates. The judge had called for a brief recess in traffic court, feeling that what was unfolding deserved more than just a few minutes of discussion. The morning sun now streamed through his office window, catching dust motes in its golden beams. "What I'm proposing," Judge Henderson said, leaning forward in his leather chair, "is a complete overhaul of how we handle cases in this courthouse. Your situation has opened my eyes to something important." Sarah adjusted herself in her seat, fighting off exhaustion. "What kind of changes did you have in mind, Your Honor?" The judge picked up a pen and began writing on his legal pad. "First, I want to implement a new intake process. Every defendant should have the chance to provide context for their situation before any judgment is made." He looked up at Sarah. "If I had known your circumstances from the beginning." "Like how journalists gather background before reporting a story," Sarah added, seeing where he was going with this. "Exactly." The judge's eyes lit up. "And that's where you could help us. Would you be willing to conduct a training session with our court staff? Share your interviewing techniques, your approach to gathering information without bias." Sarah considered the request carefully. Despite her exhaustion, she recognized the potential impact. "I could share some basic principles we use in journalism, like how to ask open-ended questions, how to listen actively, how to look for the deeper story." The courthouse administrator, Mrs. Thompson, who had joined them, nodded enthusiastically. "We could make it a required training for all court personnel, from judges to clerks. Even our security staff could benefit from this." Judge Henderson stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the busy street below. "You know, Ms. Mitchell, when you walked into my courtroom this morning, I thought I knew exactly what kind of case this would be. I've seen thousands of traffic violations, and I'd fallen into the trap of thinking they were all the same." "It's easy to do," Sarah replied gently. "In my work, I've learned that even in war zones, no two stories are exactly alike. Each person's experience is unique." The judge turned back to face her. "That's precisely what we need to remember here. Behind every case number is a human story." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Even if not everyone has been dodging bullets in Syria." Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat. "Judge, should we discuss making this part of our broader diversity and awareness initiative?" "Yes," he agreed quickly. "But I want to be clear. This isn't just about race or assumptions based on appearance. It's about taking the time to understand each person's complete story before making any judgments." Sarah pulled out her reporter's notebook, her professional instincts kicking in despite her fatigue. "If I may suggest something, in journalism, we have a saying, the first story is rarely the whole story. Maybe that could be a guiding principle for the court as well." Judge Henderson wrote that down on his pad. "That's excellent. Mrs. Thompson, could you schedule a meeting with the other judges? I want to present this idea to them as soon as possible." As they discussed the details, a gentle knock came at the door. The young law clerk, James, poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, but Ms. Mitchell's story about the Syrian hospital is trending on social media again. People are starting to make connections to what happened in court today." Sarah wasn't surprised. News traveled fast in the digital age, but she saw an opportunity. Your Honor, maybe we could use this attention to highlight the positive changes you're planning to make in the court system. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Yes, but let's make sure the focus stays on the larger issue, the importance of looking beyond our initial assumptions and giving everyone a fair chance to be heard. Mrs. Thompson smiled. Who would have thought that a simple speeding ticket would lead to all this? Sometimes, Sarah said, remembering countless stories she'd covered. The biggest changes start with the smallest moments. By early afternoon, the story of what happened in Judge Henderson's courtroom had spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Local news vans were parked outside, their satellite dishes reaching into the sky like metal trees. Inside, Sarah sat in the courthouse cafeteria, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. Miss Mitchell, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see Maria, one of the courthouse cleaning staff, holding out a fresh cup of coffee. I heard what happened in court today. My son, he's in law school. Would it be okay if I took a picture with you to show him? Sarah smiled warmly, standing up despite her tiredness. Of course. As Maria's colleague took their photo with a phone, Sarah noticed other courthouse employees gathering nearby, many holding phones showing her recent news reports. Is it true? One of them asked. About the children's hospital in Syria? Were you really there when the bombing started? Before Sarah could answer, Judge Henderson appeared in the cafeteria doorway. He had removed his judicial robes and looked more approachable in his regular suit. Everyone, he announced, I know we're all impressed by Ms. Mitchell's work, but she's been traveling for over 24 hours now. Let's give her some space. The crowd respectfully dispersed, though many stayed within earshot, curious about what would happen next. The judge sat down across from Sarah, placing a folder on the table between them. I just finished a conference call with the other judges, he said, opening the folder. We've unanimously agreed to implement the changes we discussed. Starting next week, we're introducing new procedures for all cases. He pushed a document toward her. We're calling it the Complete Story Initiative. Sarah looked at the paper, fighting to focus her tired eyes. The document outlined a new approach to handling cases, emphasizing the importance of understanding each defendant's full circumstances before making judgments. There's something else? Judge Henderson continued, his voice carrying a note of emotion. The State Judicial Board got wind of what happened today. They want to use our courthouse as a pilot program for similar changes across the state. Sarah sat up straighter, her journalist's instincts overriding her fatigue. That could have a significant impact on thousands of people's lives. Exactly, the judge agreed. And they want you to be part of it. They're offering to contract you as a consultant once you're back from your overseas assignments, to help train judges and court staff across the state. A young intern rushed into the cafeteria, holding a tablet. Judge Henderson, Miss Mitchell, you need to see this. She turned the tablet around, showing a major news website. The story of their courtroom encounter had gone viral, with social media users sharing their own experiences of being judged too quickly in the legal system. It's trending nationwide, the intern explained excitedly. People are calling it a watershed moment for judicial reform. Sarah and the judge exchanged glances, both somewhat overwhelmed by how quickly everything was moving. Your Honor, Sarah said carefully, may I make a suggestion? Of course. Let's make sure this story doesn't become about just you or me. Let's use this attention to focus on the bigger issue, how quick judgments can affect people's lives, and how taking time to understand each person's story can lead to better justice. Judge Henderson nodded thoughtfully. You're right. This is bigger than us. He looked around the cafeteria, where people were still watching them with interest. You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about how journalists gather stories. Maybe that's what we've been missing in our legal system, the understanding that every case is actually a story about real people, real lives. Sarah finished her coffee, feeling a second wind coming despite her exhaustion. Stories have power, Your Honor. They can change how people think, how they act, how they judge others. And sometimes, the judge added with a smile, they can even change an entire system. 1 week had passed since the memorable morning in traffic court. Sarah sat in her apartment, finally recovered from her jet lag, watching the changes she had helped spark unfold across the news. On her television screen, Judge Henderson was giving an interview to a national news network. What happened that day changed more than just our courthouse, the judge was saying, his usual stern expression replaced by one of genuine openness. It made us realize that justice isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding people. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her editor. Your story about the courthouse reforms is trending even bigger than your Syria coverage. When can you file? She smiled, looking at the notes spread across her coffee table. She had been working on this piece for days, trying to capture not just what happened, but what it meant for the future of the justice system. Her laptop showed the first paragraph of her article. Sometimes the biggest stories happen in the smallest courtrooms. What began as a routine traffic violation in Jefferson County has sparked a nationwide conversation about justice, judgment, and the importance of looking beyond first impressions. A knock at her door interrupted her writing. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Thompson, the courthouse administrator, holding a large manila envelope. Miss Mitchell, Mrs. Thompson said warmly, I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to bring you these personally. She handed over the envelope. These are the first week's results from our new Complete Story initiative. Sarah invited her in, and they sat at her small dining table. Inside the envelope were dozens of case summaries, traffic violations, minor offenses, and civil disputes, all handled under the new system that encouraged judges to learn defendants' full stories before making decisions. The results are remarkable, Mrs. Thompson explained, pointing to the statistics. Compliance with court orders is up 60%. People leave feeling heard, even when the judgment doesn't go their way. Other courthouses are calling daily, asking how they can implement similar changes. Sarah scanned the documents with a journalist's sigh. And the judges? How are they adapting to the new approach? Mrs. Thompson smiled. Judge Henderson leads by example. He starts each session by telling defendants about the day a war correspondent taught him to look beyond his first impressions. She paused. He keeps your press badge photo on his desk, you know. Says it reminds him to always ask for the whole story. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was a video message from Syria, the children from the makeshift classroom she had visited. Their teacher had shown them the viral video of what happened in court, and they had recorded a special message for Miss Sarah and the judge who learned to listen. As she watched their smiling faces, Sarah felt tears in her eyes. One little girl held up a sign that read in careful English, "Thank you for telling our story. Now you're helping tell everyone's story." Mrs. Thompson wiped her own eyes after watching the video. You know, when you first walked into our courthouse, nobody could have predicted this outcome. Now we're implementing training programs, changing procedures, and most importantly, changing minds. Sarah nodded, thinking about how a simple traffic ticket had led to all this. It's like what I see in my war reporting. Change often comes from unexpected places. Sometimes it takes a small moment to show us what needs to be fixed in our bigger systems. Judge Henderson wants to know, Mrs. Thompson said, standing to leave, if you'll consider being a regular consultant for our judicial training programs. Once you're done with your overseas assignments, of course. Sarah looked at her packed travel bag in the corner, ready for her next international assignment. Tell him yes, she said firmly. Some stories are too important to not be part of them. As Mrs. Thompson left, Sarah returned to her laptop, ready to continue writing. Her article would tell more than just what happened that day in traffic court. It would tell the story of how justice works best when it comes with understanding, and how change can start with a single moment of seeing someone for who they really are. 6 months later, the Jefferson County Courthouse looked very different from the day Sarah Mitchell had first walked in with her speeding ticket. New signs in the lobby read, "Every case has a story, and listen first, judge second." The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating a newly installed wall display showing success stories from the Complete Story initiative. Sarah stood in front of a packed courthouse auditorium, no longer in travel-worn clothes but in a crisp business suit. The audience included judges, court staff, and legal professionals from across the country, all eager to learn about what the media had dubbed the Mitchell method of judicial reform. When I walked into traffic court that morning, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, I was just a tired journalist who had missed a deadline. But what happened next showed us all something important about justice and judgment. In the front row, Judge Henderson nodded, remembering that transformative day. He had traded his intimidating judicial robe for a regular suit, part of the new approach to make the court feel more approachable. Next to him sat Mrs. Thompson, who was busy taking notes for the next phase of their reform program. In the past 6 months, Sarah continued, showing slides on the big screen behind her, over 50 courthouses across the country have adopted similar reforms. Traffic court compliance is up, repeat offenses are down, and most importantly, people leave these courtrooms feeling heard and respected. She clicked to the next slide, showing the familiar image, the Syrian classroom where she had filmed her story about children studying during wartime. As a war correspondent, I learned that every story has layers. The same is true in our justice system. Behind every case number is a human being with their own struggles, their own journey. The audience listened intently as Sarah shared more success stories. There was the single mother who had been rushing to pick up her sick child when she got her ticket, the elderly veteran whose medication had made him confused about his court date, the young student working 3 jobs to pay for college. Under the new system, each of them had been given time to explain their circumstances. Judge Henderson stood up to join Sarah at the podium. 6 months ago, I was that judge who thought he had seen it all. I had stopped looking for the story behind each case. He paused, looking out at his colleagues. Ms. Mitchell didn't just change our courthouse that day, she changed me. From the back of the room, James, the young law clerk who had first recognized Sarah, raised his hand. The number of appeals has dropped by 70% since we implemented these changes. People accept the judgments more readily when they feel they've been truly heard. Sarah smiled, remembering how it all started. The system works better when we remember that justice isn't just about laws, it's about people. As the presentation concluded, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from the teacher in Syria, showing her former students now in a proper classroom, rebuilt after the conflict. They were holding up signs thanking the American courts for learning to listen to everyone's story. Judge Henderson looked at the message over her shoulder, his eyes misting slightly. You know, Ms. Mitchell, that speeding ticket turned out to be the most important case I ever handled. Sarah nodded, thinking about how far they had come. The courthouse now had a dedicated team of story listeners, trained staff who helped gather background information before cases went to court. They had even started a program to help other courthouses implement similar reforms. As people filed out of the auditorium, a young black woman approached Sarah. I have traffic court next week, she said nervously. Will they really listen to my story? Sarah smiled warmly. Yes, they will. That's what justice looks like now, at least in this courthouse, and soon, hopefully, everywhere. Looking around at the transformed courthouse, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. From a war zone to a traffic court, from a simple misunderstanding to a national movement for change, sometimes the biggest transformations come from the smallest moments of being seen, heard, and understood.